glad to be with you today. Today I'm going to talk to you about America's fairy tale, L. Frank Baum, The Wizard of Oz, and its legacy, a subject which is very, very near and dear to my heart. I hope that we can get through this without too much excessive trivia, but we'll see what we can do. Got a point man back here. So I guess the first thing I want to put to you is, just a sort of a general question. Why do we love The Wizard of Oz so much? I'm assuming here that we all do love The Wizard of Oz so much, and that's why we're here. Anybody have a particular reason they love it? Oh, it's just like one of my classes. Okay. All right. But in general, I think we probably do if we're here today. How did it become so important to our culture? Because it is very important to our culture, right? That a day doesn't go by, really, that we don't open a magazine or see something on TV that says, I'll get you my pretty and your little dog too, or Toto, we're not in Kansas anymore. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. I've seen a lot of that one recently. So it's become very, very much a cultural touchstone within our lives for several generations now. And I'm hoping to kind of take you through a little bit of a storyline here to show you how it became so important to our culture in really just barely over 100 years, which is quite quickly. Most fairy tales, most true fairy tales that we think of are European, come from the oral tradition, and they are hundreds of years old. They are 500 years old, 600 years old. The Wizard of Oz has become very, very important to us in really a very, very small historical amount of time. That's quite interesting to me anyway. It all begins with L. Frank Baum, and he was a man who lived from 1856 to 1919. You may never have heard of him before. He did not have a particularly sensationalistic life. He had a pretty normal life. He was married, he had 4 sons. But he did do a remarkable thing. He wrote The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. And he said in his introduction to The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, folklore, legends, myths, and fairy tales have followed childhood through the ages. Every healthy youngster has a wholesome and instinctive love for stories fantastic, marvelous, and manifestly unreal. The story of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was written solely to please children of today. It aspires to being a modernized fairy tale. So he was specifically trying to work, alongside the fairy tale tradition. He read Grimm's fairy tales. He read Hans Christian Andersen. He actually wrote about these things. He read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which was quite well known at that time. It was only about 50 years old. And he was taking those influences in and trying to create something new but old at the same time. This is about the oldest picture we have of L. Frank Baum. He is not a child in this photo. He is about 26 or so. And this is in a play that he wrote called The Maid of Iran, in which he's acting. But he was born in Chittenango, New York. He was the 7th of 9 children. He was homeschooled until he was 12 years old. And he left military academy at 14 after a heart attack. He was born with a heart defect that sort of plagued him all his life. And he daydreamed and made up stories all the time. He was quite well known in the family for that. This is a picture of his wife, Maud Gage, became Maud Baum, and his 4 sons grouped around her, Frank, Robert, Harry, and Kenneth. And anyway, you can pause that, Josh?
Like right there?
There we go, yeah. Just a fun little story about meeting Maud. This is Maud a little bit later in life. Again, we don't have tons of photos of her. But the story goes he met her at a party, a cousin's party, and was introduced to her and said, this is Maud Gage, you will love her. And he looked at her and said, Miss Gage, consider yourself loved. And they married shortly thereafter. Now you can go on. And so this is L. Frank Baum a little bit later in life, kind of a classy portrait. He is quite well known for the number of jobs and hobbies he took on that made him almost no money at all. He was a stamp collector and actually wrote a book about stamp collecting as a very young man. He was a chicken farmer. He raised Hamburg chickens. He was a failed theatrical actor, as you saw in the photo a few minutes ago. He wrote and starred in his own plays and basically burnt a theater down one night. He owned a general store in the Midwest called Baum's Bazaar, and he let people take so many things on credit that he was unable to keep the store open. He was a newspaper editor and columnist. He actually succeeded fairly well at this, but it didn't make him any money. And he was a traveling salesman, which once again, that line of work was defeated mostly by his heart defect, his health problems. So, yeah, his first real book was the Book of Hamburgs in 1886. He was 30 years old. It's a book on rearing chickens. And since we're talking about nonfiction, I'll show you his other great nonfiction work a little bit later. The Art of Decorating Dry Goods, Windows, and Interiors, a riveting work. His first real children's book is Mother Goose in Prose, 1897. This is a book which shows, it has stories explaining the Mother Goose poems. And it was mostly inspired by his mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She was a very famous suffragist. You would have heard of her if Susan B. Anthony hadn't written her out of feminist history. And, but she was very, very active in the civil rights community, early civil rights community, suffragism, working with the Native Americans. And one thing she saw is that Frank was very, very good at telling stories to his children. And she encouraged him to write them down and put them in a book. And this was his first one. If any of you are enthusiasts of early American children's literature, the art here is by Maxfield Parrish. He's quite a well-known children's illustrator. And really his big first success was Father Goose, His Book. You can guess what that's like. It's a book about the stories of Father Goose when he has to stay home because Mother Goose has joined a women's club. And he wrote it with pictures by this man, William Wallace Denslow, W.W. Denslow, who was a very successful Chicago artist, had a very distinctive style, drew a lot of ads and posters. And it's pretty much known that a great deal of the success of Father Goose is down to Denslow's art. As much his art as Baum's poems, if not more so. And I think the next slide shows you some examples of the poems with Denslow's art. Denslow has this very unique graphic style. He enjoyed playing with sort of 2-color and 3-color art. It's very, very distinctive. When you see it, you pretty much know it. The poems are not particularly good, in my opinion. They kind of have not survived ravages of time. Then they went on and published this little thing, which was the follow-up, called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. They did it together, and this is basically the front cover and the back cover. Once again, you can see Denslow's very, very graphic art, and he really worked to make this a beautiful graphic object. Color printing for children was quite rare at the time, but he did 24 of these color plates, which were considered extremely beautiful and extravagant in 1900. And he liked to do things like break the frame. They're really quite lovely. You can see another example in the display case outside. He also did 2-color illustrations throughout the rest of the book, on almost every page. There are some examples on the next slide, like that. And he actually shows Dorothy's journey, going through different lands of Oz. The colors change as the story goes on. These are really quite remarkable, and if you get a chance to look at The Wizard of Oz, they're fun to examine. So I've got here Not a Dream, and that's to remind me to tell you that there are several major differences between The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book, and the movie that you're probably more familiar with. Among these is, of course, the fact that Oz is not a dream in the book. Oz is a real place that Dorothy goes to and returns from, and will return to again later. She is quite forthright. She's very persistent. In the movie, she douses the witch with water as an accident because her friend the Scarecrow is in trouble. In the book, she does it because she's really upset and annoyed. She's just generally a much more headstrong character in the book than in the film. And of course, Also in the book, her famous shoes are a different color. Anybody know what color they are in the book?
Isn't it silver?
They're silver, that's absolutely right. You know why they became ruby in the movie?
Technicolor.
Technicolor, to show off the Technicolor process, that's correct. Yeah, this is a number of different, hold please, a number of different editions of The Wizard of Oz. Came out in successive years. This one here, sort of the green banner at top and the mostly red illustration, is the one in the cabinet out there. I've just opened it to show you the end papers, which have photos from the movie. Next, yes, thank you. And I'd like to stay on this one for just a moment. Some of you will have heard that The Wizard of Oz is something called a parable on populism. That the Yellow Brick Road is the gold standard, and that the Cowardly Lion represents William Jennings Bryan, and that Tin Man represents silver, and all sorts of other things. This is a very prominent and persistent theory that was originally proposed by Henry M. Littlefield in American Quarterly Magazine in spring of 1964. It is in fact so persistent that I know it is being taught as genuine history at Vol State right now. I'd love to speak to the person doing that. Many people believe it is true. It is not true. Littlefield came up with it himself. Perhaps Baum had that in the back of his head, but he certainly never claimed any such thing. He always claimed that he was just trying to entertain children. And Littlefield, in fact, came back, next slide please, to write a second article almost 30 years later to tell us all that he'd made it up. So even he claims that it has no basis in fact. It's a theory he came up with. So if you ever hear that one, please tell whoever is saying that it's genuine history that it's really just an interesting way to look at the book. All right, so hold on this one for a moment if you wouldn't mind. It's very tempting to think that we went from this very popular book, because The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was an extremely popular and successful book, in 1900, straight to the famous Judy Garland movie that we all love in 1939, almost 40 years later. And that's not true. There's a really significant step a lot of people forget about, which is The Wizard of Oz, the Broadway extravaganza. I hate to call it a stage play, because it isn't a stage play in the way we think of one today. It's more like a collection of songs and comedy skits and variety show things with a very loose plot wrapped around them. It was meant to take hours and hours. You went for the whole evening to experience this thing. But it was called The Wizard of Oz. It was the first time that the title was shortened to that. And it was just insanely popular. It was a tremendous hit. It was co-written by Baum, and the costumes and sets were designed by Denslow. It opened in Chicago in 1902 and hit Broadway in 1903 all the way to 1904, almost 2 solid years, and then toured nationally for the rest of the decade. And even beyond that, actually, I'm sure you know when a Broadway show is big enough, they then license it out to let communities do it after that. So people were putting on their own version of this show well up to like 1920. Very, 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 very popular. And I'm sure you'll notice all these extra characters that you aren't familiar with. That's because the play has fairly little relation to the book. The 3 main characters are Dorothy, the Scarecrow, and the Tin Man. The Lion is just a cameo. There's the Lost King of Oz, and there's a maid from Kansas. Dorothy has a pet cow. It's all quite interesting. And the poppies, this is the poppy field scene. The reason they look so strange is that they're actually all dancing girls dressed as poppies. This scene is particularly famous and was basically interpolated into the film later. I'm sure you all remember that in the film, when Dorothy falls asleep from the poppies, the good witch Glinda makes it snow. So she will come back to life. That is from the stage show, not the book. In the book, they have hundreds of little mice friends who come and rescue them. Yeah, next slide, please. So the 2 really big stars that come out of this stage show were Fred Stone and David Montgomery. They were sort of a comedy team, and they played the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. And they became just enormous stars out of this thing. Here they are, actual photographs of them in costume. There are lots and lots of these that survive. Very, very popular. And they did everything from songs to they did a comedy routine about playing football. It was a very strange show. The way Broadway shows worked is they brought in a lot of songs that were popular at the time, as well as songs written for the show. And they would also bring in like topical humor and things like that. They were always rewriting these shows. So the show that debuted in 1902 is actually really extremely different from the show that closed in 1909. It's really kind of bizarre. But these were the big characters to come out of it, the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. And so, in 1904, Al Frank Baum decided to go back to the world of Oz for a book, The Marvelous Land of Oz. Quite conspicuous by their absence are Dorothy and the Lion. Instead, it focuses on the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. To the point that they've got Montgomery and Stone in the end papers. And Baum really hoped to turn this one into a stage show as well. By this point, though, he and Denslow had a huge fight and never wanted to speak to each other again. So Baum went off and wrote a new stage show based on it, and it flopped. This is kind of a pattern that emerged. But he did have a very popular book, and as a result, he got a new illustrator for it, John R. Neal, who was a comic strip artist and illustrator. And Neal would end up illustrating all the Oz books for almost 40 years. And Baum would try different things to not have to write a new book, but it was pretty obvious by about 1908 that he was going to be writing Oz books. So these are some of Neal's illustrations from those next couple of Oz books. And then this is all of the Baum Oz books, all 14 of the novels from 1900 all the way to 1920. These are their original editions, first editions. Some of them are really quite rare now. Not mine, I should add. So over the next 15-ish years, if you'll hold on this one for just a minute, Baum became basically a celebrity. He was as big as J.K. Rowling in his day, and the Oz books were absolutely huge. The Wizard of Oz was basically republished throughout the world, and he ended up publishing dozens and dozens of children's books. And you'll see the ones here that were basically under his own name, or at least many of them, but also quite a few were not under his own name. He, let's see, he did quite a few books as Floyd Acres, which were adventure stories for boys. They were Adventures at Sea and Adventures on Land. He did a series, a very popular series of books for girls called the Aunt Jane's Nieces series, in which he wrote under a female pseudonym. There were about a dozen of those. He wrote very, very small, stories for very, very small children under the name Laura Bancroft. He had like 5 different pseudonyms, and he wrote dozens and dozens and dozens of books over those next 15 years or so, until finally he passed on in 1919, and that's one of his last portrait photographs. Yeah, next slide, please. So although Baum had died, and although he was actually honored in newspapers as like childhood's best friend has now gone, the publishers decided that they wanted some more money. So they went out and they hired Ruth Pullman Thompson, who was a young newspaper, sort of like a picture pages writer for children. Hired her to write some Oz books, and she wrote the next 19 over almost 2 decades. And then when she retired, more people did them, including the artist Neal. He wrote 3. And so this is sort of the rest of the Oz series right here. And these are a few covers that Neal did. I always think his covers are particularly beautiful. But there was a yearly Oz book, as the last slide said, from 1913 all the way to 1942. There we go. And the final Oz book was in 1963. They'd really slowed down by that point, mostly because Neal himself died in 1942. It was hard to find a replacement, and there were paper shortages from World War II. So the last 20 years, there's only about 5 books that was that. But they did continue to be reprinted by the publisher all the way up through the 70s. the end of the 70s. And so I'm sure you're all wondering at this point, why did I never read Oz books when I was a child, right? Never saw them or anything. Well, next slide will tell you that one. They were banned from many libraries and schools. And I think that's particularly appropriate. We are at the end of Banned Books Week right now, so it's an appropriate thing to talk about. Hold on this one for just a moment. Go ahead. Thank you. They were banned from the Chicago Public Library in 1928, and I've got here pictures of sort of the three big stars of the Oz books. We have Glinda and her fascinating headdress, the Princess Ozma and the Princess Dorothy. Oz is mostly matriarchal. Baum had taken a cue from his mother-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage. All the people with true power in Oz are women. And the Chicago Public Library decided that was a reason to ban it, because it depicted women in authority roles. So, that was good. Next one. Yep. The Detroit Public Library decided that there was no value to the Oz books and they wanted them taken off the shelves in 1957. Some people think that's a result of the communist scare, because Oz is basically socialist, like a lot of fairy tale worlds. But there's also something going on that most libraries did not want to deal with a 40-book series. So they just found a reason to get them off the shelves. And the next one, Florida libraries declared them flatly unwholesome. And I've put circus 1960 here because I found a couple conflicting dates, 1959, 1960. And then my favorite is the next one. In 1986, 7 fundamentalist Christian families went to the courts to get The Wonderful Wizard of Oz taken out of the school curriculum. And hold on this one if you would. I'm sure you can guess why. One of the complaints was, of course, that they involved witchcraft. Another one was, though, that they elevate animals to the status of humans and give them speech, which is pretty good. And another one was that they teach self-reliance instead of dependence on God's will. So that's quite interesting. Anyway, these Tennessee families took it all the way to the Supreme Court, who rejected it. But you won't find it in the Tennessee school curriculum now. Next slide, please. So even with all these books kind of fading away from libraries, we have other media throughout the 20th century to take it on. The first true Oz film is in 1910. It's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It is only 15 minutes long, and it takes a lot of its cues from the stage play. You can even see Dorothy's cow friend. You can see this one on YouTube. It's quite interesting. Next. Baum himself did 3 silent movies. He threw a lot of money into them, and then they didn't make any back. But he did 3 Oz movies in 1914-15. And then in the 1920s, there was a version of The Wizard of Oz that barely resembles the book. It did 2 remarkable things, though. It introduced the idea of farmhands turning into the Oz characters, which you will remember from the Judy Garland film. It is not in the book. And also, Oliver Hardy of Laurel and Hardy fame is the farmhand who becomes the Tin Man in that film for about 5 minutes. Then we get to this one. We all know this one, right? This is the famous film from 1939. And this is one of the lobby cards. I loved it. All the advertising insisted on doing the Tin Man's face as if he was fully human. But this was a big deal. And I'm sure many of you have read about it or seen documentaries about it, so I'm not going to really hover on it. But Hollywood had talked about making The Wizard of Oz for most of the 1930s, and they went through a whole cavalcade of stars that might be involved. Comedian Eddie Cantor, Shirley Temple was rumored for Dorothy at one point, but this is what we ended up with. And they struggled and struggled with the script. There were versions where the Wicked Witch had a son. There were versions where Dorothy was a lost princess of Oz, which is taken from one of the silent films. What they ended up with is not totally authentic to the book, but it's actually a lot closer to the book than you might expect for a 1930s Hollywood film. And, of course, we all love it today. One of the interesting things about the famous film, though, is how much they tried to promote this continuation of America's beloved fairy tale, going so far as to drag Baum's widow, Maud, into publicity photos with Judy Garland. They had her release various statements about how much she loved the film. And then Ray Bolger here, who played the Scarecrow, was known to be a fan of Fred Stone, who had played the Scarecrow on stage. They even put him in a radio interview. They put them together in a radio interview and speculated that, you know, the movie would be based on the stage show. It's not really, but early versions of his makeup certainly recall that version of the character. Of course, this is how most of us really got to know The Wizard of Oz, right? It was a yearly television event for basically 50 years, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. It was there on television before everybody had color TV, and then of course people did have color TV, and wow. I remember this from my childhood, and it's still on TV today, but after 1998, it ceased to be a network event, meaning you just watch it with an antenna, and I believe it's 2001 was the last time that they ran it as a once-a-year event. After that, it just entered regular cable rotation. But there are other versions of the Oz story that have persisted. There's The Wiz from 1975, which is the first all-African-American Broadway show. Quite successful and lots of fun, if I do say so myself. And that, in turn, spawned a movie, which you may have seen. It's not the best movie ever. It kind of goes on and on. It does have most of the score of the play. The play is actually quite close to the book. The film is not. But it does have the charm of Michael Jackson as the Scarecrow and Diana Ross as an adult Dorothy. And just to continue this general theme, a few years ago we had The Wiz live on NBC, quite a nice production. Kind of returned to its roots with a very book-centric version of the story, and updated music, including Queen Latifah, Neo, Stephanie Mills, who originated Dorothy on Broadway, returned to play Aunt Em. Really a fun production. This is my favorite because of my general age. Return to Oz was Disney's summer blockbuster spectacular, and it was a terrible, terrible flop. But a lot of us love it because great care was taken to make the characters and the sets look like the work of John R. Neal from the books. Walter Murch, who was the director, was a huge fan. And some of the characters from the books that you might know as a result of Return to Oz include TikTok, Jack Pumpkinhead, and of course a version of Dorothy who's closer in age to the Dorothy from the books. She's only about 10 years old. Some of you have probably seen Oz the Great and Powerful with James Franco. That came out a few years ago. Was quite a big hit, and they still keep talking about another one. It's interesting to me that in the wake of Harry Potter, there's a lot of interest in the witches. That's really kind of taken over. Here recently we've got Lost in Oz, which is Amazon's new cartoon. It's sort of a futurist version of Oz. It's really interesting. It's for sort of mid-grade level kids. Lots of fun. But my preferred cartoon is actually the next one, which is Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. This is WB's new Boomerang cartoon, incorporating the MGM characters and music with actually a lot of L. Frank Baum characters and stories. It's sort of Oz through a Looney Tunes filter, if you can imagine that. It's quite funny and quite fast-paced. Of course, many, many people love Wicked, right? There was the Gregory Maguire books. They started in 1995, telling the story of Oz from the Wicked Witch's perspective. And then, of course, there's the very, very popular Broadway musical, which started in 2003. I don't know if you saw, they announced just this week there's going to be a TV special celebrating 15 years of Wicked on Broadway for Halloween. So that's very popular right now. And hold on this for a moment. If you want to know more about any of these things, because I am just blazing my way through this, come join the International Wizard of Oz Club, which has been established since 1957. We have a journal, comes out 3 times a year. There's an example of one just outside this door. Of course, I would recommend it to you because as of this year, I edit it. But our next issue, if you like Wicked, has an exclusive interview with Stephen Schwartz. It's 10 pages long. He talks a little bit about the upcoming Wicked movie. Lots of stuff you haven't heard before. So that's my pitch. Join now, and for $30, you get this wonderful magazine and a free membership. Think about it. Next slide, please. Yeah, finally, before we start the movie, I want to clamp down on a couple of things. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of terrible stories about the Munchkins, about how they were drunk and how they were rowdy and how they took over MGM, and those are just flatly untrue. The Munchkins were lovely people, many of them little people who had never met other little people like them before. There were over 100 of them who were brought to MGM to play the Munchkins. And for many of them, it was just a life-changing experience. You can see them modern day over here. Unfortunately, all of these individuals have gone now. Jerry Marin, who played the green lollipop kid over there, who has the ball cap on and the red jacket in this photo, died just a couple of months ago. He's our last Munchkin celebrity. But something fun you can do when you watch the movie today is keep an eye out for Jerry in his green lollipop guild costume, or young Margaret Pellegrini in her blue flower pot hat. Apparently, the directors just loved them because they are in almost every shot, even if it doesn't make any sense for them to be there. Suddenly they will be behind Glinda, and then they'll be behind Dorothy, and then they'll be behind Glinda, and they'll be behind Dorothy. They're just in shot after shot after shot, and it's fun to look out for them. Next slide, thank you. I also want to tackle this one real quick. How many of you have ever heard about a hanging munchkin or a hanging stagehand in The Wizard of Oz? It is not true. It's supposed to be in this scene, in the Tin Man's Forest. It is, in fact, an exotic bird. They went and got a couple of dozen exotic birds from a Los Angeles zoo. There's a toucan, there's some cranes, there's a stork, and one of them has craned its neck out in the background in one shot, and it looks like somebody hanging from a rope. It is not a human being that was killed on the set of these films. For young people today, there's a wonderful new way to experience Oz. Eric Shanauer and comic book artist Scotty Young have interpreted the first 6 Oz books as Marvel graphic novels. They're all available in the children's section of this public library, and I highly recommend them. They're just wonderful, lots of fun, very, very energetic. If you'd like to read more about Oz, and particularly L. Frank Baum, I recommend The Annotated Wizard of Oz by Michael Patrick Hearn. It was everybody's lifeline back in the early days, and it's been revised since 2000. I also recommend the mid-grade biography, L. Frank Baum, Royal Historian of Oz, by Angelica Shirley Carpenter and Jean Shirley. This library will have a copy soon. And I also recommend Angelica's new book, Born Criminal, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, Radical Suffragist. I've just finished reading this. It is a wonderful book, and a very, very inspiring life story. For those who want to know more about the movie, this is just a great fun book. Jay Scarfoni and William Stillman's The Wizard of Oz, the official 75th anniversary companion. It has so many photos, so many costume tests and set designs, and just a really fun coffee table book. If you want something just a touch more academic, the same authors are releasing on Monday this new book, The Road to Oz, The Evolution, Creation, and Legacy of a Motion Picture Classic. I am in the middle of reading it right now, and there's just so much information I've never heard of before. So I really recommend this one. And finally, let's bring it all back to L. Frank Baum. This is probably his most famous quote: "To please a child is a sweet and lovely thing that warms one's heart and brings its own reward." Here he is with some of his Oz characters. And one more. Oz is intended for all those whose hearts are young, no matter what their ages may be. I think that's all of us, right? So that's my talk. I'd be happy to take any questions. Otherwise, I hope you'll enjoy the movie with me here in a few minutes. Thank you.